The heavy iron door of the west wing didn't just slam. It shuddered as Enzo's boot connected with the center panel, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the marble corridors of the Lombardi estate. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a rhythmic, wet thumping that made the hair on Enzo's neck stand like needles. He didn't wait for his vision to adjust to the dim, fluorescent flicker of the basement clinic. He lunged toward the examination table, his fingers already curling around the cold, textured grip of the Beretta tucked into his waistband. On the floor, Elena was pinned under a man twice her size, her fingers clawing at the man's face while a thick, crimson line trickled from the corner of her mouth across her white nursing scrubs. The intruder didn't look up until Enzo's shadow swallowed them both. Enzo didn't ask questions. He didn't shout. He simply lowered the barrel to the man's temple and pulled the trigger. 3 months of silence had led to this explosion of gunpowder. Enzo had been a ghost in his own home, a mafia heir with a shattered spine and a soul that felt like it had been scraped hollow by the same explosion that killed his father. He was supposed to be the man who inherited an empire, but instead he was the man who had to be carried to the bath. Elena was the only one who didn't look at his wheelchair as if it were a coffin. She was the only one who spoke to him as if he still had blood in his veins, and now, that blood was splattered across her face. To understand how a paralyzed king rose from his throne to commit murder, you have to see the way the Lombardi family devours its own. This is the moment the invalid became the executioner. Enzo stood over the body, his legs trembling with a strength that shouldn't have been physically possible. The doctors had told him the nerves were dead, severed by the shrapnel in the Sicily hit, but as he watched Elena gasp for air, the fire in his thighs felt like molten lead. He reached down, his hand steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled her up, her weight leaning heavily against his chest. She smelled of antiseptic and iron. She didn't cry. She gripped his forearms, her fingernails digging into his skin through the silk of his robe. "The safe," she wheezed, her eyes darting toward the medicine cabinet. "They didn't want the drugs, Enzo. They wanted the list." The list. The names of every judge, senator, and cop the Lombardi family had bought over the last 40 years. Enzo's brother, Marco, had been searching for it since the funeral. If Enzo had it, he was the king. If Marco found it, Enzo was a loose end. Enzo scanned the room. The security cameras had been looped. A black screen pulsed on the monitor in the corner. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a family cleaning. He grabbed a surgical tray and threw it toward the door, the clatter of metal masking the sound of footsteps in the hall. "Can you walk?" he hissed. Elena nodded, though her knees buckled. He shoved the Beretta into her hand. "If the door opens and it isn't me, you don't hesitate. You empty the clip." He dragged the dead man toward the shadows of the supply closet, the body leaving a dark, smeared trail on the linoleum. Enzo's legs gave out then, the artificial adrenaline vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. He collapsed back into his wheelchair, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He looked at his hands. They were stained. He looked at Elena. She was staring at the body, her face a mask of pale marble. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "You should have run the moment the locks turned." Elena didn't look away from the dead man. "Because I'm not just your nurse, Enzo. And that list? I'm the one who wrote it." The lights in the hallway flickered and died. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, the kind of silence that precedes a storm of lead. A heavy boot clicked against the marble. Then another. They were coming for the survivor. Enzo gripped the wheels of his chair, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the door. The handle turned slowly, a metallic groan echoing in the small room. Enzo didn't breathe. He watched the shadow of a pair of feet stop just outside. A low, familiar whistle drifted through the wood, a tune their father used to hum. "Marco." Enzo reached for the spare magazine in his pocket, his fingers finding the cold, oily metal. He looked at Elena, who was crouched behind the examination table, the gun leveled at the door with a terrifying, professional stillness. The door creaked open an inch. Marco didn't step into the room. He shoved a flashbang through the gap. The world turned into a white scream. Enzo's ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sound of his own pulse. He felt the heat of the blast against his face, the smell of magnesium burning the back of his throat. He lunged blindly toward where he remembered Elena standing, his hands grasping at the air until he felt the fabric of her scrubs. He pulled her down, shielding her body with his own as the first burst of automatic fire chewed through the drywall above their heads. Splinters of wood and plaster rained down on them like snow. Marco's voice drifted through the smoke, calm and conversational. I know you're in there, little brother. I know the girl is alive. Just give me the ledger and I'll make sure her death is quick. Enzo's vision cleared just enough to see the silhouette in the doorway. Marco stood with a tactical rifle cradled against his shoulder, his face illuminated by the rhythmic strobe of the emergency lights. He looked bored. Enzo reached for a scalpel on the floor, the silver blade glinting in the dark. He knew he couldn't win a gunfight from a chair, but Marco had made one mistake. He still thought Enzo was a victim. "The ledger isn't here, Marco," Enzo shouted, his voice cracking through the ringing in his ears. "It's already at the DA's office. If I don't check in by midnight, the Lombardi name dies tonight." Marco laughed, a jagged sound that had no humor in it. He stepped into the room, his boots crunching on the broken glass. "You were always the favorite, Enzo. The smart one. The one who studied while I bled for the family. But dead men don't check in with the DA." He leveled the rifle at Enzo's chest. Elena didn't wait for him to pull the trigger. She rose from behind the table like a shadow, firing 3 shots in rapid succession. The first hit Marco's shoulder, spinning him around. The second shattered the medicine cabinet. The third hit the oxygen tank against the wall. The explosion didn't kill them, but the fireball that erupted from the tank threw Marco back into the hallway, his clothes ignited by the blast. The room filled with thick, black smoke that tasted like plastic and ozone. Enzo grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her toward the service lift in the corner. His legs felt like they were made of water, but he forced himself to stand, using the lift's railing for support. "The garage," he gasped, his lungs burning. "The keys are in the desk." They tumbled into the lift just as the hallway outside began to swarm with Marco's men. The steel doors slid shut with a final heavy thud, leaving them in the darkness of the rising shaft. If you believe that Elena is the only reason Enzo is still breathing, hit the like button so this story reaches the people who know that loyalty is bought in blood. The lift opened into the private garage, a cavernous space filled with the scent of high-octane fuel and expensive leather. A fleet of black SUVs sat like sleeping predators under the dim orange lights. Enzo didn't head for the armored Cadillac. He headed for the vintage motorcycle in the corner, the one his father had given him before the world fell apart. He knew the SUVs were tracked. He knew the gates would be locked. But the motorcycle could fit through the pedestrian side exit. He climbed onto the seat, his legs shaking so violently he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. Elena climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist like a vice. "Hold on," he whispered. He kicked the engine over, the roar of the 1,200 cubic centimeters motor drowning out the sound of the sirens approaching the estate. He didn't turn on the headlights. He drove by memory, the bike weaving through the pillars of the garage as he accelerated toward the narrow exit. He heard the screech of tires behind them. Marco's men had found the stairs. A black Suburban swerved into their path, attempting to ram them into the concrete wall. Enzo leaned the bike low, the footpegs scraping sparks against the ground as he slid beneath the SUV's front bumper. They burst through the side exit, the cool night air hitting their faces like a physical weight. They weren't safe. The Lombardi estate was on a hill, a winding 5-mile strip of asphalt between them and the city. Enzo looked in the rearview mirror. 4 sets of headlights were crested the top of the hill, descending toward them like hungry eyes. He opened the throttle, the bike screaming as it hit 100 miles per hour. The wind tore at his hair, the blurred trees on either side of the road looking like ghosts. "The ledger," he yelled over the wind. "Where is it really?" Elena leaned closer to his ear, her breath hot against his skin. "It's not a book, Enzo. It's a tattoo. It's on my back. Your father knew this day would come." The revelation hit Enzo harder than the wind. His father hadn't trusted his own sons. He had trusted a girl who was supposed to be a nobody. Every name, every bank account, every bribe was etched into the skin of the woman he was currently trying to save. A bullet whizzed past his helmet, shattering the bike's side mirror. One of the SUVs was pulling alongside them, the passenger leaning out the window with a submachine gun. Enzo saw the sharp curve ahead, the devil's elbow. It was a 300-foot drop into the ravine. If he slowed down, they'd be riddled with lead. If he didn't, they'd fly off the cliff. He looked at the speedometer. 110. 120. He felt Elena tighten her grip. He didn't brake. He waited until the SUV was inches from their rear tire, then he slammed the bike into a lower gear and drifted. The back tire smoked as it slid across the asphalt, the bike turning nearly sideways. The SUV driver, blinded by the smoke and the sudden shift, jerked the wheel too hard. The heavy vehicle clipped the guardrail, the metal snapping like a toothpick. Enzo watched as the SUV vaulted into the darkness, the headlights spinning through the air until they vanished into the trees below. He didn't look back for the explosion. He straightened the bike and pushed it harder, the city lights of Chicago finally appearing on the horizon like a sea of diamonds. They reached a safe house in the south side, a nondescript auto body shop owned by a man who owed Enzo's father his life. The metal shutters rolled down behind them, sealing them in a world of oil and silence. Enzo collapsed off the bike, his legs finally giving out for good. He lay on the concrete floor, staring up at the rusted rafters. Elena knelt beside him, her face smudged with soot and blood. She began to unbutton her scrubs, turning her back to him. In the dim light of a single shop lamp he saw it. A masterpiece of needlework, a map of corruption hidden beneath the image of a weeping willow. "My father was a monster," Enzo whispered. Elena looked over her shoulder, her eyes hard. "He was a king. And he knew only one of you was fit to wear the crown." The shop phone rang. A single, piercing sound in the quiet garage. Enzo knew who it was. He knew Marco wouldn't stop until the map was erased. He reached for the phone, his hand trembling as he pulled it to his ear. "I'm at the shop, Marco," Enzo said, his voice flat. "I'm alone. Come and take what you want." He hung up and looked at Elena. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. I need you to find the gasoline in the back. If they get through that door, you burn it all. You burn the map. You burn yourself. Don't let them have a single name. If you believe that this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this." Elena didn't move toward the gasoline. She moved toward the workbench, picking up a heavy iron chain. "I'm not burning anything, Enzo. We're finishing this." She began to wrap the chain around her knuckles, her eyes glowing with a ferocity that made Enzo's blood run cold. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a victim. She was the Lombardi's final weapon. The sound of a heavy engine idling outside signaled the end of the wait. Marco was here. The metal shutters groaned as someone tried to pry them up from the outside. Enzo pulled himself up to a sitting position against the bike, his fingers wrapping around the handle of a heavy wrench. The shutter flew up, and the first man through the gap was dead before his feet touched the floor. Elena swung the chain with the precision of a thresher, the metal links connecting with the man's temple with a sickening crunch. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, her white scrubs making her look like a vengeful spirit. Enzo watched as she neutralized 3 men in 30 seconds, her movements a blur of calculated violence. Marco stepped through the opening last, his arm in a sling, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look at Enzo. He looked at Elena. "You ruined everything," he hissed. "That map belongs to the family." Elena stood between the brothers, the blood-stained chain dripping onto the floor. "The family died with your father, Marco. You're just a scavenger picking at the bones." Marco pulled a small, silver derringer from his pocket, a hidden backup. He leveled it at Elena's heart. "Then I'll take the map from your corpse." Enzo didn't think. He didn't feel the pain in his spine. He used the bike's frame to launch himself forward, his body colliding with Marco's knees. They went down in a heap of tangled limbs and metal. The derringer fired, the small-caliber bullet thudding into the wooden workbench. Enzo pinned Marco's throat with his forearm, his weight pressing down with the strength of months of repressed fury. Marco clawed at Enzo's face, his fingers searching for his eyes. "You were nothing." Marco wheezed, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. Enzo didn't answer. He reached for the heavy iron lock on the floor, the one used to secure the shutters. He raised it high above his head. "I was the favorite, Marco," Enzo whispered. "Because I knew when to kill." He brought the lock down. The silence that followed was absolute. Enzo slumped over his brother's body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt a hand on his shoulder, Elena. She helped him back into a sitting position, her fingers gently wiping the blood from his brow. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The map was safe. The air was gone. The king was dead. Enzo looked out the open shutter at the first light of dawn breaking over the city. He wasn't the man he used to be. He was something harder. Something colder. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. Elena stood up, offering him her hand. "The DA is expecting us at 8, Enzo. We have a long walk ahead of us." Enzo took her hand, his fingers locking with hers. He didn't look back at the garage. He didn't look back at the bodies. He looked at the woman who had carried the secrets of an empire on her skin just to keep him alive. They walked out into the morning air, the sound of the city waking up around them. The Lombardi name was dead, but as Enzo looked at Elena, he knew that for the first time in his life he was finally free. The ledger was gone. The blood was washed away by the rain that began to fall. As they disappeared into the crowds of the south side, Enzo realized that he didn't need a throne to be a man. He just needed a reason to stand up. And Elena was the only reason he'd ever need again. The map was hers. The future was theirs. The war was over. They didn't look back. They didn't stop until they reached the glass doors of the Justice Center, the sunrise reflecting in their eyes like a promise of a world without shadows.